right, welcome back from the break, everybody. We are going to get started with our keynote speaker, Professor Anand Pandian, and I'm going to quickly read his bio before we begin. Professor Pandian teaches anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. His books include, most recently, A Possible Anthropology, Methods for Uneasy Times, and the anthology Anthropocene Unseen, a Lexicon. He has also authored Walled In, which examines walls and boundaries in the cultural life of the contemporary United States, Real World, and Anthropology of Creation, based on years of fieldwork with Tamil filmmakers, artists, musicians, and craftsmen. Aya's accounts, A Ledger of Hope in Modern India, which takes his grandfather's life in Burma and India as an aperture for a century of tremendous aspiration and upheaval, and Crooked Stalks, Cultivating Virtue in South India. In 2018, he organized an international virtual conference called Displacements for the Society of Cultural Anthropology Biennial. We will find a link to his writings and share that with you guys in the chat. And here is Professor Pandian with Walls of the Mind. Thank you, Professor.
Hi there. Thank you so much, Carly, for that kind introduction, and to you and the other organizers for the kind invitation to join you all. These are definitely peculiar times. They're very difficult times in some ways, but one of the unanticipated rewards of this time of global lockdowns that we find ourselves in is the chance to take part in geographically distributed conversations that we wouldn't otherwise, I think, have access to, the ability to really participate in the ways that we've all been trying now with these platforms. So I want to commend you all for putting together such an interesting event. I'm really sorry that I have had the chance to listen to a number of the talks, including just the previous one by David Mills and a couple earlier today and yesterday. I'm also, like so many of us, juggling children at home and the demands of work, and so I haven't been able to tune in continuously. But what I want to share with you today definitely does resonate with some of the threads that have come up. As Carly mentioned, I am an anthropologist. Is the sound okay, by the way? This is one of those things that...
It is. It's perfect.
Okay, all right, good. If there are ever any issues with connections or whatever, just send me a message or just call out, and we can adjust from there. As Carly mentioned, I'm a cultural anthropologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. My research has primarily been in India, but since the 2016 presidential election in the United States, I have embarked on a different kind of research project that has taken me on travels throughout the United States, trying to make sense of this particular political predicament we find ourselves in this country, and how one might make sense of it in anthropological terms. The book that Carly mentioned is one that I've wanted to call Walled In. And the contention essentially that I make is that the politics of walling off the United States, of clamping down on the border between the United States and the borders between the United States and the rest of the world, makes sense in a cultural and historical context in this country in which Americans, in ever so many ways, have come to take for granted and to live with and depend on everyday walls and boundaries that actually isolate themselves from others, most especially from strangers that they don't know that well. And that this particular politics, this xenophobic politics that David was once again speaking of just now, is one that relies on, to a great degree, on that everyday infrastructure of isolation, of exclusion, of, in fact, social distancing. This has been a curious time to try to put these arguments forward, or to try to figure out what to do with a book that was essentially written at the end of last year and has been sitting with a publisher for the last few months, given the really breakneck speed at which things have changed over the last few months here and around the world. Doing my best to try to figure out how the manuscript will have to be retooled to meet these new circumstances. So what I'm in a process of rethinking, in a sense, that project. And what I'm going to share with you is something that I did, in fact, write last year, but I hope still speaks not only to some of the concerns that have come up in this particular conference, but also more generally, perhaps, to the situation in which we find ourselves. And so, what I'm going to do is to just speak. I'm gonna actually go to my slides if I can, and I'm gonna talk to you just for a couple minutes about the book in this moment, and then shift into sharing with you one particular chapter. I should say as well that, can you all see this now? Can you see a black screen, I assume, right? Do you see that
We
image?
do. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, this is actually an image of the border wall between the United States and Mexico, Tijuana, or southern San Diego, and these images are, of course, evocative. They carry with them the sense that there are stories here to be told, and we've seen many evocative images over the last few years of the kind of hardship that people have endured on account of this rise of more xenophobic and racist politics in the United States. But many of us, of course, also work not only with images, but with words, and with the images that stories can evoke, with the kinds of images that good storytelling can bring to mind. And I say all this by way of affirming the importance of storytelling that is signaled by the very framing of this particular conference, and to say as well that the book itself is written very much in a narrative mode. Telling stories from particular places around the country as a way of inviting readers into a different understanding of the collective circumstances in which we find ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, this particular moment has, in some ways, continued or maybe even radicalized certain trajectories that were already underway in the United States, but it's also confounded them in some difficult ways. So, as you probably know, relatively recently, a few weeks ago, the president of the United States announced that all immigration into the country would be temporarily suspended. It was walked back. So many of these declarations typically are, but it invited all kinds of excited reactions from the right, including this particular image that was shared as a response to the president's tweet. Sorry, we're closed. I share this not only to call attention to the continued salience of walls and boundaries at this present moment in the United States, but also to point out a certain kind of paradox in the political situation in this country right now, where it does seem as though some of the people who've been most avidly organized around the idea of closing off the country are now speaking most vehemently about the importance of opening it back up. We all know that the question of political coordinates when it comes to who is masking in this country, who's refusing to mask, all of these valences are quite complicated, and they're actually quite confounding vis-a-vis some of the customary assumptions we might make about who in the country is most attuned to a politics of fear and a politics of security. So there's a lot to unravel here. I've just begun to kind of work this out. I'm not really sure that I have any answers with regard to these conundrums, but I do have some stories, and I want to share one of those with you. All of this, of course, as I mentioned earlier, predates the actual pandemic. So the book that I'm going to share some material with you from is a book, as I mentioned earlier, called Walled In, and it's a book that makes the case that if we're to understand the politics of walling off the country, we have to look at other kinds of everyday walls that people have come to live with and take for granted, which I think of as, say, the walls of the home, walls on the road, the walls of the body, and what I also want to call the walls of the mind. That is to say, the ways in which our getting access to information, our absorbing particular pictures of the world, particular stories of what's happening beyond the circle of our immediate lives, all of those things also have the effect of producing quite hard boundaries sometimes between what we consider plausible and implausible. I think David was speaking to this as well with regard to the idea of framing. And this is a chapter in which I try to make sense of those kinds of boundaries by entering into a series of conversations with an old friend of mine from high school whose political commitments are very different from my own. But we get there by a kind of detour through a conservative media apparatus in the United States that I think you've also heard a bit about over the last couple days, which is Breitbart, which is also based in Southern California. So I began this chapter with the conundrum of why an operation like Breitbart would be centered in and anchored in a kind of liberal hotspot like Southern California, and move into a series of other stories that I hope will shed some light on what I want to call this notion of the walls of the mind. This is, again, going to be in a much more narrative style, so forgive me if it seems less explicit argumentatively. We can get into some of that in the Q&A. The idea is really to try to see the extent to which one can convey the importance of particular ideas or positions in the actual weave of an unfolding story. Oh, I should also mention, by the way, that out of curiosity, I was spending some time on Breitbart. I was curious how it is that QUB might appear in this particular media universe, and predictably enough, it was when Hillary Clinton was named chancellor of the university that Breitbart went a bit wild with regard to that particular evidence. So I don't know, again, if folks have comments on that, I'd be glad to hear about them. So we actually began with Breitbart's headquarters in Southern California. I'm actually going to be reading now, and if I'm looking away, I'm looking at another screen from which I will be reading. Breitbart News Network is headquartered in a nondescript office building on San Vicente Boulevard in West Los Angeles. There's no signage outside that brick building with dark tinted windows, nor is there any evidence of the company's presence in the lobby inside. The building was less than a mile away from where we lived for much of 2017, and I drove or biked past it countless times. I was profoundly curious about what went on inside, the hashtag war on the boardroom door that journalists have reported seeing. But there was no obvious way to approach the company for a visit or the beginnings of a conversation. Eventually, a mutual acquaintance put me in touch with one of Breitbart's senior editors. "I'm out of town at the moment, visiting my early hominid ancestors, Homo conservatus," the editor joked in reply. I was surprised by his lighthearted tone and his jest about anthropology. He offered a half-hour meeting at a nearby cafe, asking that the conversation be off the record, asking what I hoped to accomplish in our meeting. As an anthropologist, my method is to canvass first-hand perspectives and contrary points of view on topics that people would otherwise tend to take for granted, I replied. I'd like to interview you briefly regarding your sense of Breitbart's role in shaping public opinion in the country at present, I wrote, an earnest entreaty in what felt like an unexpected opening for dialogue. Lastly, I've heard intriguing reports about your war room and would like to give, in my own writing, if possible, I wrote, a brief sense of what your operation looks like from the inside to better situate and contextualize the stories that one finds on the website. Soon enough, I learned that I'd pushed too far. There's no way I can discuss what goes on inside the company, especially as we've never met, the editor wrote back. To me, that is a red flag, and I'm afraid I will have to cancel our meeting. Dozens of journalists sought him out each day, he added, and most of them have malevolent intentions, either political or commercial. The turn in tone was swift and unexpected, and there was no going back. A wall had gone up, impossible to scale. That was a bad week, he finally conceded a few months later when we crossed paths briefly at a public event. We were getting threats, he said. We had a bunker mentality. But he and I never had the chance to talk again. I've since replayed this exchange many times over in my head. Was there malice in what I wrote? I'd clearly come across as far too eager. And you don't have to be an anthropologist to know that social life always has the potential for overstep boundaries and defensive reactions. How to make this feel more like a friendly knock on the door than a home invasion? I'm at war with the mainstream media because they portray themselves as objective observers of reality when there's no such thing, the late Andrew Breitbart wrote in his memoir, Righteous Indignation. The book by the founder of the Breitbart News Network reads something like a bemusing coming-of-age story and a hard-nosed primer for cultural insurrection, taking on the task of grasping, as Breitbart puts it, the architecture of a world that I resided in, but couldn't see completely, the Democrat media complex. How did this shadowy network operate? What did it mean to try to look beyond it? This challenge is particularly interesting in Breitbart's case because of where he grew up, in one of the bastions of America's liberal elite, the glitzy suburbs of West LA. And it brings into focus, therefore, a larger mystery, the question of how people form their views of the world and their sense of political necessity. For, despite its reputation as a liberal utopia, Southern California has long been a crucial fount of American conservatism. Both Reagan and Nixon have their presidential libraries here. The Claremont Institute is a highly influential center for conservative political thought, while many prominent American media personalities on the right, Matt Drudge, Hugh Hewitt, Dennis Prager, Ben Shapiro, launched their careers in the Los Angeles area. Stephen Miller of the Trump administration grew up in the People's Republic of Santa Monica, as this famously left-leaning coastal enclave is sometimes known, while Steve Bannon honed his political instincts in the notoriously liberal circles of Hollywood. California is, according to Breitbart's editor-in-chief, Alex Marlow, a huge laboratory of, essentially, leftism. His readers from the state often lament their political isolation, while those from elsewhere fantasize about a different kind of border wall altogether, one that could isolate California from the rest of the country. How would this environment become a seedbed of American conservatism? The situation demands a political epidemiology, as The Intercept has put it, an effort to identify the soil in which stark ideas take root. Is this pace of reading okay? I can't see anyone.
It's okay? Great.
Yeah? All right, good. Okay. For me, this trail, this political epidemiology, led close to home, as this was where I grew up myself. My father took a job at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Los Angeles in that summer of 1980. With the zeal of immigrants for education and opportunity, my parents scrapped together enough to send my sister, brother, and I to a pair of prestigious prep schools, since merged into a single institution, the Harvard-Westlake School. As it happens, it was from this school that Alex Marlow would graduate in 2004, a few years after my younger brother, the editor-in-chief of Breitbart, that is. And he wasn't the only alum from Harvard-Westlake to join the staff of Breitbart. Reporter Julia Hahn, class of 2009, wrote a number of incendiary dispatches on immigration and Islam before heading into the White House with Steve Bannon and Donald Trump in 2016. Was this anything more than a coincidence? Harvard-Westlake's upper school campus is slung onto the northern slopes of the Hollywood Hills, not far from the film and television complexes of Studio City. When I returned to the campus in the spring of 2017, more than a quarter century after I'd graduated, I was struck by the stunning views of the San Fernando Valley and the mountains to the north. Why hadn't I noticed this before? The air was probably hazier then, but I'd also spent most of those years looking down instead of up, having quickly learned in junior high to size up my peers by the logos on their shoes, always pricier than the Kmart sneakers that my parents picked out for us. Coming back after a long time, I paid a visit to the school archives, curious to see what Marlow's senior yearbook page had looked like. I found a sober young man looking back at me from one corner of the page, surrounded mostly by close-up portraits of a kitten. This is the editor-in-chief of Breitbart, by the way. He'd named favorite concertos by Tchaikovsky and others, and his list of life top 10 began with 1, God, 2, family, and 3, baseball. Of all those who had graduated with him that year, Marlow was the only one who'd posed for his class picture in a sport coat and tie. That doesn't surprise me, one of my old teachers said when we met for lunch a few days later. It was a wonderful surprise to find her and a few others still teaching at the school. Marlow had passed through all of their classrooms. He had a very traditional style to him, very courteous, a much more mature way of talking and sounding and acting than other kids, another teacher recalled. He was a throwback in a way. All of them felt that there was much less political discussion and debate on campus now, with conservative students far less inclined to speak up than before. Maybe they withdrew to their corner of the internet, one teacher speculated as we sat around one of the hexagonal tables of the cafeteria courtyard. It's a fine line, another added. If you push too hard, the kid's not going to feel safe in the classroom anymore. You want to open up their eyes a little, or push them to articulate how they're feeling, but you can't go too far because, well, they're young. They're adolescents. They take things very personally. They're very sensitive. If they think you hate them, they're just going to shut everything down. This was something, of course, that all of us tend to do, especially in the face of intense convictions and heated disagreements. Over the years, I had sidelined my own childhood friends who lead conservative. It was only after the election in 2016 that I began to feel sheepish about this and tried to rekindle some of those bygone friendships. I was glad when an old friend from LA reached out on Facebook that December. "Hi Anand," he wrote. "Can't believe we're not Facebook friends." Tacking on a warning as well. "Please don't judge my politics, LOL." Ruben had lived up the street from my family in Encino, and we'd carpooled together to school for many years. We sat side by side in the front row of Dr. Pete's homeroom in 7th grade, trying not to snicker at his graphic lessons in sex ed. Ruben still lived in LA and had just launched a small legal firm of his own. His Facebook feed revealed someone who relished a dirty martini and a good cigar, not to mention a bit of online jousting, the chance to thumb his nose playfully at liberal friends. We began to meet up for lunch near his office downtown. We enjoyed arguing with each other, and it was a way to figure out how we had come to diverge so much. Like me, Ruben was no outsider to the educated elite of the country. But as we began to hang out again after many years, it became clear that our sense of the world was shaped by very different facts. I was worried that summer about the climate change of the Paris Agreement, which the United States had just repudiated, concerns that didn't seem to register with him at all. Meanwhile, he would bring up events and scandals that I could hardly recollect. The reset button presented by Secretary of State Clinton to Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in 2009, or the Tea Party groups targeted by the Internal Revenue Service during the Obama years. "Are you serious? Oh my God, how do you not know that?" Ruben would ask each time something like this came up. "This is what shocks me," he added, "about living in separate bubbles. One of the most common things you see conservatives saying is, 'Look at this big fucking deal,' and it's on page A38 of the New York Times, the paper of record. You hear that all the time." "Do you remember where you heard about the IRS going after the Tea Party?" I asked. "That's the problem with our bubbles," he replied. "It was all around me." "And it wasn't around me at all," I added, laughing. The black hair on his pate was thinning now, and mine was getting grayer by the day. How had we gotten to this point of mutual incomprehension, growing up around the corner from each other in the 1980s? On the radio these days, conservative commentators speculated that the political chasm in this country verged on civil war. Ruben agreed that it was serious. "I think we're coming apart at the seams as a country," he said soberly. We were talking over lunch that afternoon on Ventura Boulevard, the long and typically gridlocked artery through the San Fernando Valley that we used to take to school each morning. "I was an oddball, I never quite fit in," Ruben recalled. His family had emigrated from London to Los Angeles when he was 6. They were Armenian by ancestry and Christian by faith, from a community that had settled centuries ago in Iran. He lived now in the suburb of Glendale, an Armenian-American stronghold, and his children went to an Armenian school. He was always a traditionalist, very loyal, his mother told me a few weeks later, at Ruben's spacious split level in the Glendale Hills. She and her husband greatly admired Reagan and Thatcher, and they had made this known as the family would watch TV together each evening in the 1980s. "I was a Republican before I was a conservative," their son recollected. "I knew they were the good guys, but I didn't know why." I had my own idea of the good guys back then, but to be honest, I thought I knew exactly what made them so. They, like me, simply knew better. Dan Quayle made a cameo on my senior yearbook page. "Verbosity leads to unclear, inarticulate things," along with some well-worn radical quotables. "World, get a clue," I declared, capping off this smug parade. Ruben, meanwhile, grew up as a hardcore fan of heavy metal, and the Scorpions got top billing on his senior page. "They're watching you, they're watching me, they're watching you, taking all the world under control. They make you laugh, they make you blue. In the end, they try to eat your soul. We can't escape the media overkill." Paging through that 1990 yearbook, we laughed at how contemporary these lyrics from the Scorpions felt now, conservative diatribes against the mainstream media and all. Ruben didn't remember sharing these words as a political gesture. The Scorpions were my favorite favorite band. I grew up with them, he said. Still, the problem of media influence got him vexed even now. Why are they mostly left-wing? Think about it. It's the biases that push people in certain directions. Most people go into the media wanting to change the world. Conservatives don't want to change the world. That's the whole point of being conservative. In the late 1980s, while we were still in high school, Rubin discovered Rush Limbaugh. It was almost by accident. A friend had been teasing him for his political views by calling him Rush, and Rubin finally searched out his radio show on KFI. He began to listen in earnest the next summer, as he spent day after day filing papers for a small law firm that had just set up shop in an empty office building. There was no one else there with me, and I would just turn on the radio and listen to him. Otherwise, I'd get bored, he said. So what was it about him that appealed to you, I asked. I had no idea he was listening to Limbaugh at the time. He was funny, and I was learning what it meant ideologically to be conservative. What do you mean by that, ideologically to be conservative? I asked him. Back then, what he was saying was so different from everything else around me. Being conservative was a kind of counterculture. It was a completely different way of looking at things. It was one that I agreed with. It made me realize that the points of view that I was exposed to were very left-wing. Maybe everything around me was biased in a way. I learned a lot from that. It set me on a course, he added. In fairness, after I started listening to him, I got more ideological. It became a bigger part of my life. Rubin stopped to pull up rushlimbaugh.com, chuckling at one of the lead headlines on the site. Pathological CNN is making Professor Dershowitz go bald. See, that's why I like Limbaugh, Rubin said, looking up from the screen. He'll say outrageous stuff like that and make you laugh. Rush is over the top, but he may be the most influential man on the American right. A few days later, I spent a morning listening to Limbaugh's 3-hour show on the Patriot radio station in Los Angeles, 11:50 a.m. Between promotions for window blinds and cybersecurity software, and brief segments from Fox News, we report, you decide, as their motto goes, Limbaugh inveighed against global warming malarkey, the deceptive schemes of former FBI Director James Comey, and the nonstop mindless raw hatred, as he called it, aimed at President Trump. The media were responsible for this, Limbaugh said, but so were American universities, creating, he said, literal mind-numbed robots rather than critical thinkers. Here was a more insidious Russian influence on American public life beyond any election meddling. The Russians are constantly attempting to infiltrate, and they have succeeded, he argued. Why do you think there are so many communist college professors? I burst out in spontaneous laughter when I heard these words on the radio. But when Rubin and I listened together to that part of the radio show that afternoon, his reaction was markedly different. He's referencing something factual here, he told me. The Soviet finance of American academia during the waning years of the Cold War. There are more Marxists than Republicans in academia, Rubin quipped. Everyone on the right talks about that. He promised to dig up an article that would substantiate this history, but I was less curious about the facts in this case than our respective habits of interpretation. It struck me once again, as it often did in our conversations, that Rubin paid much more attention than I did to categorical divides, to distinctions between one kind of thing and another, the fundamental difference, for example, between left and right. On another occasion, we wound up talking about a story on 60 Minutes about an undocumented pizzeria owner deported back to Mexico after many years in Indiana, and the misgivings his wife and friends had felt in voting for Trump. To me, this was another tragic story indicative of the times. Rubin, though, saw it as what he described as a classic left-wing hit piece, a bullshit tugging at the heartstrings, with a highly unusual story purely to make a political point. He was vexed because the story disguised its manipulative intent. If you want to be left, that's fine, he said, but don't sit there and tell me, oh, we're not left. There was also the basic issue at stake here, he argued, the legal categories governing who rightly belonged where. The law says he has to be deported, Rubin insisted. That's what the law says. If you don't like it, change the law. Both his family and mine had emigrated to the United States in the 1970s, and yet we saw this immigrant story in starkly different terms. I was caught up in the intensely personal drama of betrayal and expulsion. Rubin was more interested in classifying and categorizing its actors, their deeds, and the storytellers who put those events into circulation. Over time, I began to see that there was a consistency to this difference in how we responded to such views, to such news. Each of us had different facts at our disposal, but over and above these differences were the ways that we tended to frame these facts and their availability. Whether we were debating immigration, marijuana, climate change, or policing, Rubin's pointed sense of the left kept surfacing. Every position could be recast as a partisan political commitment, as an instance of that politics, rather than a real and specific concern about the world. Political psychologists have found patterns of this kind in studies of ideological orientation in the United States. What we recognize as political conservatism is driven by a higher degree of cognitive and perceptual categorization, Everett Hudson Young argued in a 2009 study at Stony Brook University. To be sure, everyone depended on categories to make sense of the world, Young acknowledged. But his extensive survey and experimental work with over 500 respondents in New York and Florida suggested a relationship between political tendency and the strength of those categorical divides in mental life. Conservatives were more likely to think with impermeable walls, rather than fuzzy distinctions and associations, working intuitively with more clear-cut boundaries between one kind of thing and another. What if it wasn't simply the case that liberals and conservatives believed in different things? What if conservatism itself was bound up with a stronger commitment to sharply defined distinctions? This is the very difference between left and right. This way of making sense of the Father's Day gift that Rush Limbaugh was hawking on the radio that June, a car magnet emblazoned with the crest of the Limbaugh Institute of Advanced Anti-Leftist Studies. Show your daddy taught you right. What Rubin himself once said, chortling about the struggles of his liberal friends to keep their principles in line. The 15-year-old teenager in me does love to see the wild gyrations of my friends on the left sometimes. There are those who argue that these dispositions have a neurobiological foundation, a controversial position to take. But you don't have to invoke biology or genetics in order to appreciate the force of such mental orientations, most especially in times as fraught as these. Think about how these various elements might build on top of each other. A personal tendency to think in hard lines and firm boundaries, a political climate of intense divisions, a media discourse that magnifies and supercharges these divides, a social life bricked into individual homes, far-flung suburbs, and private automobiles, affording precious little scope for exposure to contrary points of view. Think of the feedback loops that can take shape between these layers, forming what the political theorist William E. Connolly calls a resonance machine, a network of related feelings feeding and intensifying each other. You could begin to appreciate how Southern California might work as an accelerant for tempestuous politics, like the wildfires that rage in its chaparral canyons. Here's the final section of the chapter. I went off to Amherst College after graduating from high school in 1990, while Rubin enrolled at Claremont McKenna, a notably conservative Southern California liberal arts college founded by Republican businessmen in the early 20th century. He wrote a senior thesis under Harry Jaffa, the influential political philosopher who guided the establishment of the conservative Claremont Institute in 1979. When William Vogeley, editor of the think tank's Claremont Review of Books, was asked to speak at the Lincoln Club in downtown Los Angeles in the spring of 2017, Rubin offered to take me along as a guest. It was difficult to pass up this chance, as the Lincoln Club was the foremost Republican political action committee in California. Rarely had I set foot on such hallowed political ground. It was difficult to pass up this chance as the Lincoln Club was the foremost Republican political action committee in California. Rarely had I set foot on such hallowed political ground. But what, though, to wear? The invitation specified business attire, but being a professor more slovenly than most, I wasn't exactly sure what this could mean. With Rubin's advice, I rented a dark suit and cut my hair. I checked to make sure my fingernails were trim. I must have been on the right track, I learned when I met my friend at the door that day. You look like the president of a Republican club, he told me with a sardonic laugh. The event was held at the headquarters of another elite Los Angeles society, the California Club. Stuffy, Reuben observed as we made our way toward the dining room, past the ornate fixtures of a dim and thickly carpeted hallway. We were seated by chance beside a portrait of the mining magnate Harvey Mudd, one of the founders of Claremont McKenna. It was the 5th of May, Cinco de Mayo, and the waitstaff, polite and decorous, had plenty of margaritas on hand. Speaker Vogley had recently published a book called Pity Party, a mean-spirited diatribe against liberal compassion, a subtitle that drew laughs from the well-heeled crowd, mostly older, almost all white. He spoke at length about the enigma of Trump's electoral victory, its surprise for the conservative intelligentsia, and its implications for their movement. The victory was partly due, he said, to the clustering of Democratic votes in supermajority areas like Los Angeles County. Our registered Democratic friends seem not to like us that much and wish to avoid our company, Vogley joked. And whether or not it hurts our feelings, it seems to hurt their electoral prospects. But, he added, it's not just a physical distance between red and blue America. There's a psychic and philosophical distance as well. The left, he suggested, was increasingly antagonistic to the idea of comity, of respect for others' opinions, the notion that in this big country, we need to find ways to get along, to live and let live. And this, Vogley argued, had a lot to do with the theories to which they subscribed, peculiar canons of thought, which insisted that, quote, there is no justice, there is no nature, there is simply power, and people either take it or they don't. At one point, Vogley made a joke about professors, apologizing in advance to any that might have been there by chance in this club of attorneys, bankers, and businessmen. If I spoke out at that moment, I might have asked if the situation was as stark as he painted it. For many of the liberals that I knew, professors even, shared most of the values that he lauded. At the time, though, it seemed better to listen. And what I heard again and again were the rumblings of a war I had no idea was on, at least on the terms being articulated here. Many people I knew were angry, yes, but their ire was mostly focused on concrete targets. Trump, the Republican Congress, regulators who cozied up with lobbyists. Here, though, the enemy seemed far more expansive and ungraspable. The left, whatever that was, bent only on realizing itself. How could the response to its machinations be anything but anxious? My friend Reuben posed one of the last questions that afternoon at the Lincoln Club. He was concerned about the difficulty of remaining a sincere conservative between a new president who had made a head fake in their direction and a left making its decisions on purely instrumental terms. Do we face the same danger of conservatives looking at the world that way? Yes, whispered the elderly and bespectacled woman sitting beside me. She was a retired banker and a longtime member of the Lincoln Club. When she learned I was a professor, she told me how unsettling she found the campus environment at UCLA these days, close to where she lived in West Los Angeles, packed with so many strange-looking and unpredictable characters. As she saw it, even Fox News was becoming unreliable in their reportage, a tad bit lefty now and then. She'd taken to watching the One America News Network instead. Reuben joined us as we stood chatting at the close of the event, along with an investment banker sporting an elephant tie. Welcome to the resistance, my old friend joked. Don't worry, she assured them both, nodding over at me with a grave look at her face. I will convert him. So this is where the chapter itself ends, or the chapter draft itself ends. And I want to just share one more image with you before I close, one more thought with you before I close, which is that I have, in the last few months, kept in touch with a lot of folks that I've been thinking and talking with regard to this particular book project. And it has actually been quite interesting for me to try to follow the ways in which people have been making sense of the demands of the pandemic in particular in relation to some of these deep-seated and long-standing political commitments that I've been speaking of. So for example, one small businessman in the state of Michigan has been very active on Facebook over the last couple of months, sharing images such as this one, sorry folks, this shit won't work on me, being what, an image of someone holding up a sign saying, danger, you're being conditioned to view your freedom as selfish. it's a very peculiar moment right now because the politics of protection, care, of addressing sources of fear and anxiety that for so long in this country has been tethered to kind of creating more boundaries and sealing people off is now seen as a commitment of folks on the left in particular, liberals and leftists in particular. And folks are on the right are left sort of defending their inclination to remain open and exposed in the interest of defending their freedom. So that does confound, I think, a lot of the politics that I've been wrestling with in this book project and trying to make sense of over the last few years. I'm not really sure what all that amounts to yet. I think I have some rewriting and some rethinking to do, but this in any case is at least a glimpse of what I've been working on, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Pandian. That was so interesting, and I can't wait to get my hands on your upcoming book. It sounds so fascinating. I myself am looking into anthropology as a PhD and really am interested in creative ethnography. So to start off these questions, I wanted to ask you a little bit about coming to choose creative ethnography as that works for this particular book.
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that a lot of us who are perturbed by those of us who are perturbed by any collective political circumstance have to acknowledge at some level that those politics are propelled by stories to a great degree. They're propelled by not only narratives, but visions of the world, visions of what is happening in the world, visions of what it is that propels transformation for better or for worse, that are anchored in particular forms of storytelling. And there was a lot of consternation among people who think of themselves as social critics. Got a little thing saying that my internet connection may be unstable, so if you can't hear me properly, let me know.
Okay,
There was
will
a
do.
there was a lot of consternation in this country among people, or there has been a lot of consternation among people who think of themselves as social critics, as to the unwillingness of people to take facts seriously, take the reality of circumstance seriously, to take expert opinion seriously. And I think this is a good moment for us to ask ourselves about the idioms in which we convey what we know, the language with which we convey what we know, the means by which we share the commitments that we hold dearly ourselves. And ethnography, to me, is one way to open up those commitments in perhaps a more radical and in some ways perhaps more inviting manner. That is to say, ethnography is a medium by means of which a writer, as a storyteller, brings readers and auditors into the space of other people's lives as a way of trying to convey that there are, in fact, very different ways, not only of seeing the world, but of living in it. And
Right.
that sense of tangible, immediate possibility that comes from the immersion in a good story could also be, I think, a really important political and critical tool. So my commitment to doing this kind of writing is deeply bound up with my sense of the critical promise of more radical modes of storytelling and the more radical forms of listening that make other kinds of stories both available to us and possible to be retold.
Well, thank you for answering that. And your writing is very beautiful. So I so appreciate you reading that piece for us. So to lead into some more questions for you, we have a couple in the Q&A that I'm going to start with. Can you speak a bit about your research methods for this particular project? How is COVID-19 impacting it?
Yeah. Well, I began wandering around the United States a great deal beginning in the late in late 2016, and those travels took me to many states and many small towns and rural areas that I had never seen or set foot in, even though I was born in this country and I've lived here for almost all of my life. So that was quite eye-opening, and I met people in very different circumstances, many different walks of life, and I've managed to keep in touch with a fair number of them. I can't do the same kind of face-to-face work now that I had been doing, but I've rekindled a number of these conversations in an effort to try to make sense of how we've gotten here. And beyond that, I honestly really can't say. I don't feel like I have an effective read yet as to what
Mhm.
is happening in this country. But to answer the first part of that question about the actual field work, a lot of it was was haphazard in the way that ethnography often is. You find openings and you pursue them and you see how far they'll take you. There were stories that took me to particular places. There were networks of relationships that I followed. I often relied on contacts with one person somewhere that would then lead me to others. The work involved a kind of serial a set of serial stints of short-term fieldwork rather than long-term
Mm.
fieldwork in one place because I wanted to try to get a more variegated sense of what was happening in the country.
Great answer. Our next question says, this was deeply insightful. How do you think the external walls, such as borders or membership, affect internal walls of the self?
Yeah, yeah. That's in a sense what I'm trying to figure out with this project. I So again, to kind of think back to 2016 and the great surprise of Trump's victory here in the United States and what was being said at the time. It was quite interesting the number of commentators in newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post sort of unmasking the problem of the border wall or the idea of the border wall as a metaphor. Well, uh, he doesn't mean it literally. He means it only as a metaphor, as
Mm-hmm.
though to expose it as a metaphor is to hollow it out somehow. In this field work that I've been doing, it was really extraordinary for me to sort of count up the number of times that conservative people, often conservative people from rather humble, who lived in rather humble circumstances, would themselves tell me, well, the wall is just a metaphor. That is to say, this thing, the border wall, I think has always been something that straddles the divide between the literal and the symbolic. And it is, of course, an idea as much as a tangible reality. And so much of what is happening, even literally with the actual material of the border wall, has to do with the symbolic resonance that surface, that physical material carries. And so I think the way to get into this question of that relationship between literal and physical walls is to actually look at the metaphors or images that people live by, to use that phrase that George Lakoff, the linguist, gave us. What are the images that predominate in people's minds when they conceive of the world?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is, I think you could probably trace a family of images that are predicated on the need for the value of more radical distinction between the inside and the outside that animate a lot of this discourse and that cross over between the physical and the imaginative realms in all kinds of ways. That's really
Right.
I'm going to try to make sense of this. So the book, for example, begins with the metaphor of the wall, the manuscript as it exists. Who knows where it'll go? The manuscript as it exists begins with the metaphor of the wall and ends with the metaphor of the butterfly, which is an image. The monarch butterfly in particular has been a kind of symbol for a life lived through transboundary migration. It's become an important rallying symbol for DACA status bearers in the United States and immigrant rights activists who are trying to make the case that migration is actually a necessity of life. So in many ways, the politics do come down to a kind of contestation between metaphors or symbols of different kinds.
Great. Well, we are definitely rooting for your manuscript. I'm so excited to be able to read that book at some point. It's such a needed commentary on what's happening with the US at this time. Um, I am going to switch over to the chat function. It looks like we got a couple questions there. It says here from Dr. Fiona Murphy, great presentation. Love the depth of your description. I'm wondering if you could speak a little more about writing ethnographically out of a friendship and the challenges that come with that.
Mm. Yeah. Well, his name isn't Ruben, so that's one thing. This is so yes, this is a peculiar challenge here, and it's a challenge that I've had to face in other ways as well over the course of my career. My kids come in and out of most everything I've ever written, just because they're downstairs right now. I mean, they're so much a part of my thinking and waking life. I wrote a book with my grandfather, which was very much kind of structured as a dialogue between a grandfather and a grandson, in which I was a character myself. So this is something that this is a kind of proximity and an uneasy proximity to the subjects of our writing that we often do find ourselves entering into as ethnographers. But I want to also say that if one works in good faith as an ethnographer, if one works in good faith with the possibility that when you do ethnography, when you enter ethnographically into a milieu that is not your own, the people never remain strangers as such.
Mm-hmm.
They never remain strangers as such, which is to say they never remain simple objects of understanding. Then the question of how to write ethically with and about people is going to always surface. And so with this book in particular, it's been quite difficult for me to try to figure out how to balance on the one hand, critical commitments that I feel very strongly about with regard to the political circumstances in this country and the moral, ethical repercussions they have on the lives of people in the way that I think this conference is very much sort of centered on, with the responsibilities I have to the people that I've gotten to know, many of whom have actually come to see me as a friend, who've come to kind of distinguish me from others, from the left, from liberals in general, because I
Mm-hmm.
listen, right? And so what do you do with that? There is a sense of responsibility that one feels. And so I think that there are times when my writing might even lean perhaps a bit too closely to a more sympathetic register, which can become uncomfortable. I have another chapter that is anchored fully in a day that I spent with fascists at a fascist ethno-nationalist rally in Tennessee, and I'm talking with them. I was one of just a couple sort of non-white people in their midst. It was actually quite fearful, but I'm trying to get in that chapter at their sense of vulnerability, and there's a risk that one runs in doing that, in justifying it, in papering it over somehow, and making it seem okay. But I think
Mm-hmm.
it's important that we enter with good faith into that. We can come out not being convinced, but I think it's important to at least go through that experiment, because that can only serve, I think, to make our politics more robust and more effective at engaging the range of commitments that people have.
So agree with that. Yeah, it's one of those elements I feel like where when you're looking at the humanity of other people, sometimes we have to face questioning our own humanity in that. And I love that you brought up the just the difficulty of, you know, how sensitive should I be to certain things. And we have one question, I don't think we'll get quite to it, looking at the time, that a panelist sent about that, so I may ask you to go to the chat and look at that later if you can.
You can answer it too. I mean, whatever you'd like. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna move forward, I think, to one question just based off of the time we have left. This last question I'm gonna ask you live is, how does your position as an academic, outsider, and person of color affect your positionality and access while doing this study?
Yeah, that's an absolutely essential question. I We were sheltered. I think that I live in a I live in a I live in a really charming neighborhood close to the university where I work. Um, I, we live a very sheltered life in many ways, and even as a family, even as an Indian American growing up in this country, I felt quite sheltered for most of my life from the racism that runs as a powerful undercurrent throughout American society. It changed in 2016. It felt
Mhm.
began to feel different. Things touched us in ways that we never expected to be touched. I write about some of these moments in the manuscript. Moment when my son, for example, who was just turned 8 at the time, was race baited in a really horrible way at the school where he was taking at the swimming school where he was taking lessons. Things like this happened, and I think gave us a much more acute sense of exposure and existential unease, which I certainly carried with me throughout this research, still carry with me now as I have more of a sense of what lies under the placid atmosphere. I mean, I say that I live in a very nice neighborhood, but it was a neighborhood
Right.
that people of color like myself might have had. We might have had rocks or bricks thrown at us a few decades ago if we were here.
Yeah.
We hear stories like this, right? Um, so 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 yeah, I delved a bit more deeply into that. I also feel like we have to do it. Those of us who are willing to do it, have the tools with which to do it, have, I don't know, the conversational capacities that we've cultivated over years to do it, have to do it because we have no choice but to live with each other. And we have no choice but to live with each other in circumstances when there are people who actually believe it's impossible for us to live with each other. And that sense of impossibility is going to come out sometimes in a threatening way. We have to have a way of
Right.
responding to that. We have to have a way not only of responding to it, but also diffusing it. And to me, the kind of critical value of engagements like this have to do with finding a way around a more antagonistic register in which things are necessarily framed as us versus them.
Great answer. So just for time's sake, I am going to move to some closing remarks. Professor Pandian, thank you so much for this keynote. It was so fascinating. And if you can, leave any website or contact details into the chat so that we can point people into your direction for more information, especially regarding your upcoming book. I know some people would love to hear when that will come out and get that news from you. Thank you again for this great keynote.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all. I really appreciate the chance to share this work. Thank you so much for this.